So welcome today. Last time I have been speaking about the second Vipallasa, the second distortion of perception. We are going, through these 4 distortions now for the next few meetings. And the second one we spoke about last time is seeing what is painful, dukkha, as pleasant, sukha. And then I've illustrated that point, with a list for observing the code of modernity in ourselves, which comes from the book Outgrowing Modernity by Vanessa Machado de Oliveira. And I think we should just shortly reflect on that list together, once more before we go further to the next points. So these 4 points are in this list. The first one is separation from the biosphere or from nature is real. That's the foundational delusion. Separation from nature is real. And the second one is progress is linear, chasing endless goals and competition. The third one, consumption equals happiness, extracting from the planet. And the fourth one, control is essential in order to suppress uncertainty. So that's, she considers as the 4 main points which underpin the current, cultural paradigm, which is breaking up. That's how the second Vipallasa shows up in today's cultural worldview in most places around the globe through colonization and capitalism. And renunciation and letting go doesn't have a good rep, and so many politicians are just afraid to speak about it because that is a recipe for them to not stay in office. But as practitioners of the Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path, we have a very different outlook on life. And the Noble Eightfold Path is all about remembering that suffering is the result of grasping and clinging, and suffering isn't inherent in phenomena. Change is inherent in phenomena, and unsatisfactoriness is inherent in phenomena because the instability and the constant change, but the suffering is really a result of grasping and clinging onto certain ways of expectation and looking. And that, directly brings us to the third Vipallasa, which is quoted like this: seeing what is without a self, anatta, as a self, atta. And, we have often practiced together the meditation on the 4 to 6 elements, and that's a very practical, pragmatic way to experience our own bodies as temporarily coming together, as rivers rather than as things. That we can very well experience that constant flow and exchange with the biosphere, from which these bodies have emerged, through the support of our parents, in particular our mothers. And it's quite mind-boggling, to observe that on an ultimate level, we really can't determine where our bodies end. and where the so-called, environment begins. And the word environment is a very human-centric term. So I rather like to use the word biosphere. And, I've mentioned there's two examples which I find really very, kind of convincing. For example, we are now reflecting on the water we drink, which comes from the tap, from our watershed. And then we drink the water, it goes through the body. At one point we go to the bathroom, it goes back into the sewage system, then it gets purified, and then it goes out again into the watershed. So by looking in this way, it becomes extremely obvious, that our body includes the watershed where we live. And that's really, our language isn't really prepared to express that. So starting to reflect on it is really kind of brings up some confusion, because our concepts are so different. And this is why we are now kind of struggling, to find words which encapsulate the truth. And also, learning from indigenous cultures, which have very different ways of using language. Indigenous languages are generally, not very much dependent on nouns, but much more talking with words. I've heard you can talk an hour without using a noun with some of these indigenous languages. And that builds a very different way of thinking and a very different worldview. But we have the language we've got, and so we need to experiment and start looking at it in a different way than usual. And another really good example for that is, has been given by the Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, when he was this very kind of well-known example. And I think he started to do that a long, long time ago, having people sitting together and eating a raisin or a segment of a tangerine and then reflecting, This tangerine consists of the sun, the rain, the earth, the people who planted the tree, the people who looked after it, the people who harvested the fruit, the people who packed it, transported it, the people who put it out on the market or in the supermarket, and then you buy it, you pay for it. It's just like thinking in this way, we become very, very obvious, that everything works together to make this very little piece of tangerine or raisin ready for us to ingest into our body. And then it becomes part of our body for some time. And it's so mysterious. No language can really express it fully, but language can be used as signposts. And then we need to look in that direction and allow ourselves to sense and feel and intuitively understand this mystery. And one of the indigenous teachers I have been very inspired by is the Lakota ceremonial leader and musician Teokasin Ghost Horse. And he says, we are not here to understand the mystery, or we are not here to solve the mystery, he says, but we are here to accept it. And learning to accept it is through understanding it, to really stand under it, to really go close to it and sense it rather than trying to figure it out with the intellect, because that is not possible. But when you eat a tangerine in the way, the Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh teaches, then you understand it, not with the intellect, but with your whole being. And that's the only way of understanding which has any chance, to change us on a visceral, on a physical level, so that we might be able to relate to this process we call life in a different way. And that, brings us to the third Vipallasa, which, the third Vipallasa, which is about, seeing that which is not self, anatta, as a self. This insight into not self, how it's called in the Theravada teaching, anatta, or emptiness in the Mahayana and the Vajrayana. That's the central insight in the Buddha's teaching, and it was a new teaching at his time in Iron Age India. Nobody before him has taught that. Impermanence was taught and unsatisfactoriness was taught, but emptiness is a new addition which the Buddha brought. And he made it clear that a deep understanding and experience and realization of not self or emptiness is essential for liberation, from samsara, the wheel of becoming. And the first time, a practitioner sees that is at stream entry. It's the first time, really seeing correctly emptiness or not self. And there is a good simile, which I find very helpful. It's compared with somebody, splitting the ocean with a big sword, and for a moment can see to the bottom of the ocean, and then the water flows back again. But after the water flows back again, the person has seen the bottom of the ocean and never goes back again to how it was before. And that's, when the first 3 fetters are permanently cut. And then this is when the Dharma eye arises for the first time. And then there are 3 repetitions until full liberation or arahantship in the Theravada way of laying out the path. So seeing to the bottom of the ocean for the first time, and then the water flows back again, but we can remember. And then the first 3 fetters are cut permanently. The first one being Sakaya Ditti, fully believing that we are a separate self. The second one is believing in rites and rituals, thinking that if we perform certain rites and rituals, that's enough, for liberation. And the third one is having doubt in the efficacy of the teaching. So that's the first 3 fetters which are permanently let go of. And then, we experience ourselves still as separate, but when we reflect on it, it fades. And then, just in the same way as I explained the simile with the ocean, we can no longer really fully believe in it. Even it's as a habit of mind, it still is there, but it has been weakened, and we do no longer buy into it upon reflection. And, and the most important thing for this to happen in our lives is that meditation and our daily life must go in the same direction. So meditation, investigates experience, and by not finding any unchanging core anywhere, disenchantment and letting go sets in. We're loosening the grip, and then adjusting our life step by step so that our insights are reflected in our daily choices to the degree we can, So clear setting of priorities in terms of ethics and in terms of, the people we spend a lot of time with. So really a clear setting of priorities. And, that's a mutual furthering by living the insights in the crucible of our lives. This is an intertwining process of these 2 sides of the coin. On the one side, it's investigation, in meditation, in contemplation, the realization of wisdom, of insight. And on the other hand is letting go and integrating that in our lives, actualization. And then they work together. If we keep it, separate, if we don't really live from that place, it doesn't really gain the power, it needs in order to keep us moving on the path towards more depth. So the most important question is not, how many hours do I sit, how many books have I read and all of that. But the most important question is, has there been any transformation? Can I observe, in my own mind that I'm not so easily, kind of washed away by these habitual mind patterns. And there's more capacity to just stop and open, sense, feel, but not an act. And through that process, we are weakening the power of these patterns. We're digesting them. And some of them, might be so early and so powerful, they'll never really fully go away. But our grasping and clinging and gripping and holding loosens and loosens and loosens more and more. And then they become like just, oh, okay, you're here again, bye. So there's no need, to suppress it or distract, but there's the capacity to allow it to just move through. So that question, has there been any transformation? And, as I shared often, also the quote by Robert Bayer, practice is not practice unless it affects perception. Then the same thoughts, might still come through the mind, but we have a different relationship to them. We can see them, okay, they are part of my history, but that's not who and what I am. And that's, what we are trying to establish in our own practice, that capacity to welcome and to open and to allow to move through. And no longer grasping and clinging and acting on that on an individual level, but also like on a cultural level. And we can start with really simple things. For example, I've made a adhitthana, I've made a commitment with myself, that I do not drink water from plastic bottles. And with the only exception, if I'm shortly before dying from thirst, I will drink. But usually I don't anymore, and there has been maybe, since I've made that commitment, I think maybe 2-3 years ago, there have been once or twice a bit awkward situation, where people felt like, oh, she's really picky. But I just worked with that, and I do that now. And I think it probably is inspiring to quite a few people, who hear that and that they might think, oh, I could do that too, actually. It's not rocket science, So small things like that, which are not small at all. Yeah. So, the mutual furthering of insight and integration. It's like a spiral, and that spiral takes us deeper and deeper into reality. And there is more and more capacity to open to that. And then that brings up a lot of fears, unfinished business. Yeah, that's why we need noble friends. That's why we need ethics. So we can hold steady, even it doesn't feel at all steady inside. But at least, we are not being washed away and just holding steady with the stressfulness, of that pushing and pulling of those old habits and choosing to not fall into it again and again. That's what's needed, That's why it's called a practice. Okay, so today we're going to work with the third Vipallasa, seeing what is not self, anatta, as self, atta. So please, let's find a posture we can sustain for about 35 minutes. And today, I'd like to begin with a very classic practice, the reflection on the 5 body parts, how the body appears on the outside. And I will talk us through that by just listing them. It's like a mantra, for the mind to settle onto it. So, sensing your body on the cushion on the chair. And, the gentle embrace of gravity. Which keeps you in place. Now we're going to look at the body, how it appears, from outside. That's a reflection given to novices, to samaneras and samaneris when they take the novice ordination. Kesa, hair of the head. Just, listening and allowing awareness to become conscious of hair of the head. Loma, hair of the body. Naka, nails. Danta, teeth. Tacho, skin. Tacho, skin. Danta, teeth. Naka, nails. Loma, hair of the body. Kesa, hair of the head. Kesa, hair of the head. Loma, hair of the body. Naka, nails. Danta, teeth. Tacho, skin. Tacho, skin. Danta, teeth. Naka, nails. Loma, hair of the body. And Kesa, hair of the head. And as we know from our own experience, all of those parts, they are growing and then they get cut off or they fall out and constantly changing. They're not fixed entities. So that's a very tangible example also of not self, anatta. For example, before you cut your fingernails, is that you? And then you cut it off and you put it away. Have you now cut off a piece of yourself? Just that very little reflection, can be mind-boggling, so allowing that mind-boggling quality to just be there, because that's how the transformation happens. There's a sense of mystery, really, and allowing that mystery to be felt and sensed and allowed, to change us, so we can more and more accept it for what it is. But just sitting with that uncertainty, with that which can't really be pinned down, but it can be allowed to be what it is, and opening to that mystery. Which directly goes counter to the cultural paradigm of separation. And control, because there is some truth which cannot be pinned down and controlled, but they can be accepted and allowed to be what they are. By allowing the space to sense into it. And sensing the body as it sits here on the cushion, on the chair. Held in place by gravity of the planet. Built up by the elements, by food and drink and oxygen, which we take in, from the biosphere. It moves through the body and then leaves the body again, and new elements are coming in. This constant flow. So really experiencing that which is not self, experiencing that consciously. That there's not a single unchanging core to this process we call me and my body. Not a single, even the bones, who will take the longest time to disintegrate. Even the bones go back into the earth at one point, and the teeth. Even they can, be preserved under good circumstances for a very long time. There have been, skeletons found of early humans with teeth and everything still there. several 100,000 years old. But still, at one point they'll be completely absorbed. And allowing that mystery to be felt. Not trying to explain it, not trying to figure it out, but just being that. And the uncertainty, in terms of the cultural paradigm that brings. And then, waking up to the fact that we are actually participants in the planet. Emerging out of the biosphere into some shape for some time, and that shape is, aging and getting sick, and at one point, dying and merging back into it. And this process, can be felt in the aliveness, the vitality of these bodies. We are the result of a long, long chain of evolution of life on this planet. And we are not the end of that. We are not the crown of it. We are just one strand, one species, maturing and learning to participate more skillfully, and to adjust and attune and at this point in history we are called by the earth to look more deeply. So we can bring forth different systems, how to conduct life here. And as Albert Einstein is on record for saying, we can't solve a problem from the same level of consciousness which created it. Because it's just always the same old thing again and again in different clothes. So to really attend to the consciousness of who we are and where we are, and taking, inspiration from indigenous ways of looking, remembering our own indigeneity and participation here. And allowing, the earth to save us rather than thinking we need to save the earth. This is a very, kind of childish way of looking at it. We need to allow ourselves to be saved into a deeper reality by investigating all of those cultural filters which are no longer working. And for that, we really need a foundation in practice which can handle the mind, the thinking mind, which is so convincing. So sensing into the aliveness, the vitality, the way, how the planet presents as your body. And, reflecting on the third Vipallasa, the third distortion of perception, seeing that which is not self, anatta, as a self, atta. And, coming to the middle. The middle path is the term which was used for the Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path, the path between the two extremes, that this body does not exist and this body does exist. The middle path is, yes, it exists, but in a particular way which needs to be understood. So we do have a name and we do have a passport and we do have a life, clothing and shelter and all of that. We need it because these bodies are there, but the way they are there is different than what we think. Because our thinking, is very much kept prison in the language. So to investigate that and go underneath it into a direct experience helps us to open up and see that languages, concepts are signposts, but they are not realities. The map is not the territory, but the map can be useful, of course. So that is the practice, to become fluent in this middle path, which is, according to my first teacher, Ajahn Buddhadasa, called it an art and a science. The investigation part is the science. The art is the fluidity of moving in this way without getting stuck on either bank of the river, but coming to the middle and allowing ourselves to be carried. And that's why, that first insight into reality is called stream entry. It's really entering the stream. And then having no more doubt in the efficacy of that middle path between those two extremes, that this path can carry us out of the wheel of becoming. While at the same time, there is compassion and care for what is here and others who are struggling inside of that. And trying, to support the best possible scenario. While knowing at the same time it's always going to be what it is. So sensing into the aliveness, the vitality, the process nature of these bodies. And through that sensing and listening with the body into the vast body of the biosphere of this planet, which is held, in a vast space and impacted by planets and by the star of the sun, and this incredible cosmos. and trusting the process. Which means, opening to whatever comes up. When this uncertainty is really deeply felt, on the one hand, the majesty of it, and then also it challenges old patterns. Need for certainty, fear. And at one point, when we are practicing, there is no other choice than to let go into that and be willing to go through the transformation that kicks off. Because there is no, no kind of expansion of consciousness without pain, as Carl Gustav Jung said. There's always going to be some amount of pain, but it doesn't need to be suffering. Because the stretching, of anything which grows undergoes a stretching of boundaries, and that is painful just. Because there's so much, there is a release happening of potential which is locked in. And then if it's called forth, through investigation, it wants to take space, and then that's painful. So, usually we interpret pain as there's something wrong, I'm doing something wrong, I'm bad, or I'm stupid, or something like that, whatever the pattern is. And no, it's nothing to do with you or with me. This is just a law of nature. Look at the plants. I have a beautiful tree fern in the yard at the Aloka Earth Room, and when those fiddleheads, when they come out, they are so packed, the energy is so packed and bundled up in these spirals. And I can really see, how the potential, how the locked in energy is slowly kind of unfurling. There's a lot of stretching going on until that new front, stands up straight. And then ages and dies and goes back, and then a new front comes up. This is the way nature operates. And that the biosphere knows how to do this. It has been doing it for almost 5 billion years without anybody directing it. This is this self-organizing intelligence we can tap into, not with the thinking mind, but with our bodies. We don't need to solve the mystery. We are here to accept it. That's, in English, I think it's called growing pains. The growing pains, when a baby gets teeth. Painful. That's, what the Sangha supports is we can be together in these growing pains because it's so disorienting. It can be scary to open oneself to that, to invite that. And to divest, from this code of modernity. Which goes all against, the teachings of the Buddha and is an expression of the Vipallasa, really. And how could it be otherwise, in a world of unenlightened beings? The Vipallasa are operating, but we can choose to investigate and look at life differently. And come closer to reality in the way how we live, which, brings more freedom, less suffering. And we have a teaching, we have our ancestors, encouraging us from behind, and future generations encouraging us from the other side. We do what we can to respond to Earth at this time of history, where we are called to listen. And become part of the Earth immune system. So today I didn't bring a bell, so that brings us to the end of the session.